Hello, I'm Scott from Fabian Liberty, and today I'm going to be discussing the Disney film for children, Zootopia. If you like this type of content, there's more to come and more on this channel. Please give us a subscribe, like, comment, anything to help the algorithm. We're also on Twitch, where we do our live streams and some gaming videos, and all of the content that is on those two platforms is also posted on Locals, Gab, BitChute, Minds, and we have a Discord. You can find all those things in the description. As I said earlier, I'm going to be discussing the Disney film Zootopia, meant for children. But it's a very interesting film because there are a lot of political themes in this film. And the more I've had to watch it, because I myself have children, the more I realized how heavily propagandized the film was. But even more interestingly, how some of the narratives begin to fall apart, and how the strange reality of writing narrative often creates truth that you didn't necessarily intend, that I don't think the writers intended. And a lot of what we'll be focusing on is the hero of the story, Judy Hopps, and someone who I believe is the actual hero, the accidental hero, as opposed to the anti-hero that is set up as the film's main protagonist. But first, let's go ahead and transition into a brief synopsis of the film, just in case you haven't seen it. If you have seen it, or you have kids, you've probably seen it a bunch of times. Just go ahead and skip a little bit further ahead in the video. As I get a little bit better at navigating and editing on YouTube, I'll be able to put in timestamps and things like that. But right now, we're focusing on cleaning up our social media pages and just getting that content out there and engaging with the audience. So to start off, Zootopia, the setting of Zootopia is much akin to our own world, except all of the the NPCs and the protagonists and characters in the film are anthropomorphized, which is to say there are different animals that are sentient animals, and they have kind of this history that they've transcended kind of the way we might view animals today, where there are predators and there are prey, and they've transcended those things. And this is kind of eloquently done with a children's play in the beginning of the film to show like where they've come. And there is a capital city known as Zootopia, kind of like New York City, if you will, or something. Judy Hopps is the protagonist of the film. She starts off as a young girl and very quickly becomes the first bunny police officer, kind of breaking down some of those barriers, because the police tend to be predators. As the film progresses, it appears that there's a string of kidnappings in Zootopia, and all of the kidnapping, some of it's a little bit hush-hush, but all of the individuals that have been kidnapped or missing or disappeared are predators. And so you can kind of already start to see some of the narrative building and tensions of this idea of predator and prey and that occurring. So Judy is a meaner maid, and she eventually elicits the help of a fox, Nick, who becomes her partner in her first foray into policing, to help her kind of solve these cases. As the story progresses, the police chief kind of gives Judy Hopps a hard time, tries to get her to quit the force, but her and Nick work together, tracking down several leads in much comedic fashion, and eventually get this lead about night howlers. They hear some howling, and they track down these wolves, and eventually are able to find the kidnapped predators, and they're all savage. They're all suffering some type of disorder, disease, or something. They find this, and then eventually Judy Hopps gives a press conference where she kind of betrays the racial tension that has been set up in the film by stating that she believes that the reason that all of these creatures are beginning to go savage, she doesn't know, but it might have something to do with their DNA or biology as predators, and that they're reverting back to savages. This causes the entire city to go into a bit of turmoil and chaos, protests and tensions, and then eventually she quits the force and goes home, or takes a hiatus back to her, her hometown in Bunnyboro. Eventually back home, she reconnects with her old, schoolyard bully, Gideon Gray, who mentions something known as flower, Mindy Campa Holly Sympathis. Let's try that again, right? Mindy Campen Holly Synthesis. That's as close as I'm going to get. But, you know, he says, oh, well, that's a $4 word. My family used to always call them night howlers. She eventually realizes that the clue of night howlers that she heard from a panther gone savage is not the night howling being wolves where they were being kept, but night howlers was the name of the flower that was poisoning people. Judy goes and apologizes to Nick for her racist comments in the press conference, elicits his help again, and they reconnect to solve the case, tracking down the individual that has been shooting people with a gun that makes predators go savage. Eventually they realize that the assistant mayor Bellwether, who is a sheep, forced and kind of subjugated under an arrogant lion mayor, is plotting to create turmoil within the city so that the prey can take all of the institutions over and control them united against predators. And so she says that, you know, they outnumber them like 2 or 3 to 1. Now that we have a brief synopsis of the film, like, what are some of the political themes that are really deeply present in this movie? Because it's clearly not just your average princess story or your hero journey, right? There's no crone. There's no, you know, male protagonist. There's no descent into the underworld. There's none of those themes that you might expect from a traditional Disney movie. Instead, it is a political movie. It's a propaganda piece, and I don't necessarily mean that in the worst way. You know, I'm not saying USSR propaganda or anything, but it is a political movie meant to teach these narratives to children. So one of the first big themes that you notice is that the species very clearly are an allegory to race and sex relations within the society, right? Judy is treated poorly because she's a bunny, and you're not really sure, is it the species being a race thing, or is it a sex thing, like the first female police officer? Again, you see this thing with many people talking about shifty foxes and things of that nature. You know, it seems that maybe there is some idea of certain species being inherently bad. Nick has an element where he's a predator and wants to join, like, you know, the Boy Scouts type situation, and is abused because of it. So they explore very deeply, and many scenes throughout the film are very heavily talking about race relations from a very left-wing perspective, and doing it with the allegory of this anthropomorphization of the characters. Next, you know, kind of going a little bit deeper into that, kind of the same theme, is this predator-prey is very clearly an allegory for the kind of Marxist critical theory of, you know, oppressor and oppressed, right? You know, you see these themes multiple times in the film, you know, specifically with, you know, Mayor Judy Bellwether, I'm sorry, Assistant Mayor Bellwether. You can see her speaking about being oppressed, and you can kind of see these themes occur. You see this in you see this in the bullying tactics of Gideon Gray towards Judy Hopps, when he says that she'll never be anything more than just a bunny. Things like that, kind of stay in your place. The next big thing is multiculturalism. Zootopia is meant to be a multicultural haven, or a multicultural kind of utopia. You see this as soon as Judy Hopps rides through the train. There's the tundra district, the forest district, the inner city. You see these kind of all of these themes fitting together, and it's very interesting because they do play with this a little bit, you know, in honesty. Nick, you know, kind of gives this speech when he first meets Judy Hopps, kind of just ragging her naive philosophy about coming to Zootopia with like this liberal, beautiful mindset, only to find that everyone doesn't get along, right? And so the themes of multiculturalism working together and layered in there is ever present. The next thing I'd like to talk about is, you know, rural versus urban society, right? Again, in that same speech, Nick, you know, kind of trash talks her from being from, you know, a rural farming community, and there's this idea of going to the big city. There's this idea of Gideon Gray constantly being shown to have this very hickish accent, and he's, you know, so he's kind of like the butt of the joke, this idea that like this dumb hick exists out there. So you see these elements pop up from time to time. And then lastly, because Judy Hopps is a police officer and it is a cop movie as much as it is a political movie, as much as it is a movie for children, there's some references to police practices and the way in which the police are handling things, and possible police reform, and you see this when they offer Judy Hopps at one point in time, they offer her the kind of a campaign to be the face of the police department and things like that. So all of these themes are ever present throughout almost the entirety of the movie, and most of these themes are explored in a largely left-wing perspective. So Judy Hopps, the supposed hero of the story, why is she a hero, right? Like, what makes her a good hero as far as the film is concerned? Well, in much the the vein of left-wing ideology, she achieves progress, right? She she's appears to be the first female on the force. You can't really tell. There might be a token female here or there, but she's certainly the first prey creature, and she's certainly the first bunny police officer, right? And so she's kind of breaking down those barriers. Next, I mean, she does save the city at the end, right? She plunges the city into chaos, but it's her and Nick that crack the case, right? It's her and Nick that go through all of these things despite the barriers that are put in front of her, and eventually figure out what's going on and kind of save the city from these string of kidnappings and this evil plot by Assistant Mayor Bellwether. Next, she's a hero because she engages in friendships, and appears to want to break down her own, kind of like her own white privilege, if you will, right? You can kind of see that Nick is kind of, in some ways, foxes appear to be an allegory in this, like, this police relations and trustworthiness. It seems like there may be a racial thing here, like maybe Nick is meant to be portrayed as black people or something. It's hard to tell because nothing is so like obvious, and you don't want to necessarily put something there that isn't there. But it appears that Nick is meant to show a racial difference between them as opposed to a species difference. And, she does attempt to break down those barriers. When her parents are completely untrustworthy of foxes, she doesn't want to take all of the fox stun gun and all these other things, right? But she eventually takes the fox repellent. So it's like she's engaging with her white privilege, right? And lastly, she's very tenacious and she's very courageous. She never gives up. She's constantly fighting despite everyone trying to stop her. No barrier is enough to keep her out. And she is, willing to go into the face of danger at any moment. And so I think all of these things do make her, in some ways, a good hero for the story, and in some ways a good role model. No good protagonist is well crafted unless they are flawed. Judy Hopps is an anti-heroine or an anti-hero. And she does a lot of things that really should make you question whether or not Judy Hopps is a good role model for a children's movie. Things that seem to get kind of swept under the rug because I suppose of the left-wing political themes of the movie, right? She gives this racist press conference where she basically has no evidence whatsoever of why these predators are going savage, but regardless of that, she just pushes forward saying, oh, well, it must be their biology, right? It's like this harkening back to phrenology of like the 1800s and black people, or, creating cocaine laws because, crack cocaine laws because, black people were going to riot or something, right? It's very interesting and that it's kind of forgiven so easily, because you would think if the movie was so left-wing, why would they do that? But I think it becomes a plot device for really exploring these racial themes. Nextly, as far as a cop, she's a horrible police officer, right? I mean, she violates warrants. I mean, and does whatever she wants to do as a police officer, right? She doesn't follow the captain's orders. She doesn't do the job she's supposed to do. She follows these like little clues and hunches around. She is like, chasing a perp all throughout this this small like little rat town or like mouse town, and could have killed hundreds of people because of her size difference and things, but she doesn't care because she's chasing a perp. Furthermore, she violates warrants. You know, there's at one point she uses Nick by throwing something over a fence, a recording device that she had over a fence. He jumps over, and then that allows her to use exigent circumstances to, you know, break it into her without a warrant. Even more so, she eventually befriends a mobster, you know, a criminal individual, and even at one point in time towards the end of the movie uses him to threaten to kill someone and to quote unquote ice them and put them under the ice until they freeze to death, so that she can torture information out of people. I mean, it's like if an actual police officer was doing all of these things, they would be a monster. But because it's a kid's cartoon, we kind of just forgive it. Lastly, she's very arrogant and very rude, right? She's been on the force for like a week, and everyone has to know that she was #1 in her class, and that you know, she can be a detective and all of these things. So she doesn't listen to authority figures in any way, which, I mean, for a children's movie, I understand this idea of, like, you know, bucking at authority. But again, it's very reminiscent of a left-wing perspective of narrative, is this idea that, you know, someone that bucks at the institutions and doesn't follow the rules, you know, is great. You know, this isn't Dirty Harry, this is a kid's movie, and yet those themes are still there. It's very interesting. So all in all, I would say Judy Hopps is not a role model and is not a good hero. She's too deeply flawed to be a Disney hero, and yet she is, because the ways in which she's flawed are not what's important. What's important is creating elements that help explain a political narrative, right? So because this is an allegory for, you know, racism or sexism or oppressed oppressor or multiculturalism, you know, the racist press conference should make you hate the character, but instead that's not what it's for. It's not to say anything against her. The real reason for that is to create that element in the story so that those political themes can be taught to your children. Next thing I want to talk about is, who do I think is the breakout hero in this story, or the accidental hero? Something that I don't think the writers intended to be, but if you actually break down their character, they might even be the real role model of this film. And I think the real role model of this film is Gideon Grey. Gideon Grey is presented from the very beginning of the film. You know, he's only in like 3 or 4 scenes. But in the very beginning of the film, when they're explaining kind of the setting of the film, you know, Judy Hopps says something along the lines of, you know, her becoming a police officer and people are laughing. And she says, "It may seem impossible to small minds. I'm talking about you, Gideon Grey," and embarrasses him in the assembly, right? Later on, he then bullies her because she tries to stick up for her friend. So Gideon Grey's not a good kid, right? He's a bad kid who is, you know, shown to be kind of hickish. It's a very rural kind of stereotypical idea of like the dumb farmer that lives out in the country and doesn't know anything about what the smart people in this big city know, right? And he's a bad kid that scratches and harms her, right? And she stands up to the bully, and it's kind of like her first instantiation of you know, doing her power move to move up and do the right thing, right? But later on in the film, he comes back, and when he comes back, it's a very interesting scene. If Disney wasn't so bad about copyright strikes, I would just play the scene. But he comes back, and he is the #1 pastry chef in the Burrows, wearing a pink apron. He has a totally different demeanor. You know, has this wearing this big smile at some point, and he still has this dumb hickish accent, and is shown to not have a very high IQ. But when he meets her again, sorry, I apologize, backing up. When she is introduced to him again, the parents inform her that they have gone into business with Gideon Grey, and that by doing so, you know, they've kind of transcended their racist beliefs about foxes. Because towards the beginning of the film, you'll remember, you know, they were trying to give her all of these like fox repellent and fox tasers, and were telling her not to trust foxes, they're the worst, and even said, "You remember Gideon Grey, right?" And she says that was one fox who was, you know, a bad fox or whatever, right? And so their relationship is healed because of his business and his personal growth. And one of the ways you see his personal growth, is as soon as he sees Judy Hopps, he apologizes to her. But he doesn't just say, hey, like, hey, I'm sorry, I used to be bad, right? He says, like, hey, I'm sorry, I had a lot of, you know, I was a real jerk. I had a lot of self-doubt that, quote, manifested itself in unchecked rage and aggression, right? So it's very clear that he's done a lot of psychological work on himself. Either he's been seeing a therapist, or, you know, he's been doing a lot of reading or things of that nature. He's grown as an individual. And the really cool thing that they accidentally did is this kind of element of chaos, right? Where the uncontrollable thing, the thing that you never account for, right? Is that when the children, the other children of Judy Hopps' parents are running through the field and they come across those night howling flowers, right? The night howlers that, you know, kind of that spurned her the idea to crack the case. You know, the parents say, like, hey, children, stay away from that Mindy Campum Holly Cynthius. And he goes, well, hey, there's a $4 word. My family used to just always call them night howlers. And then it's like, that's that like moment where she goes, night howlers aren't wolves, they're the flowers, right? Because she didn't know that, because she wasn't a part of the culture of the colloquial term for those flowers, right? And those flowers apparently cause, you know, if even in small doses, can cause people to go crazy, right? So he's this element of chaos that actually is the element that is needed to crack the case so that Judy Hopps can actually figure out what's going on. He completely rids himself of all of his negative emotions and behavior and becomes a successful businessman. And through his personal ties is one person at a time, one pie at a time, if you will, is getting rid of the perception of foxes in society. So he has done nothing but grow. And I think, and I'll explain a little bit more in just a second, but I think he's the real hero of the story. So I want to talk about the accidental narrative of Zootopia. And what I mean by that is it's very clear that the film was written, directed, conceived of by political activists with a left-wing perspective or bias. And the problem with that is anytime most ideologies, be they right-wing, libertarian, communist, authoritarian, it doesn't matter, right? They tend to narrow their view of the world. And when you put things into a story and you start to really flush out a story, oftentimes what happens is that, you know, narrative fiction reveals truth, right? Because things don't, you can't have cognitive dissonance and then edit a story, right? Because eventually, whilst you go through the editing process, people start to say, like, hey, these things don't make sense. You need to add this in here. This will make the scene more cohesive, yada, yada, yada. And so what I think ended up happening is that they attempted to create this political piece in this Zootopia film so that they could teach young children about Marxist and critical race theory, and about, you know, sex and race relations and police practices were kind of, I think, you know, much more on the back burner, but it's all about multiculturalist philosophy and Marxist ideology. But one of the things that happens is these little themes and these little elements and these little scenes kind of show how their own film doesn't make sense, right? And so one of these is like this personal growth versus activism thing I'd like to talk about. Judy Hopps is the activist, but it doesn't make sense. It's not balanced until they give a redemption narrative to Gideon Grey. I would almost be willing to bet that that probably wasn't even in there in the beginning, that it probably got added later or was conceived of later than the story of Judy Hopps, right? So her redemption story from her racist press conference and the redemption story of the city has to be mirrored by Gideon Grey's redemption story. But at the same time, it's not really necessary, because he's not in Zootopia. He doesn't, I mean, he has some involvement with her life. It makes more sense with him there, but you could take him out and it would still be okay. But that element is added in, and it shows the difference between an activist and an individual that works on themselves. And I would say moving forward, Gideon Grey becomes that element of chaos. That's why I think he was probably added in later, is because the idea for the Night Howlers, the thing that the flash of genius, if you will, that finally breaks the case wide open, is Gideon Grey. It's not Judy Hopps, right? She's informed of this of what Night Howlers are, not necessarily that she came up to it of her own accord. And so if you look at these two people from a utilitarianist perspective, right, what is the damage that both of them have done? And you'll find that while Gideon Grey may have done some individual damage when he was a child, being somewhat of a bully, his growth, his business, his trade-based and psychologically looking inward kind of introspection, all of these things have resulted in healing racist ties around those people around him and made him a successful businessman and, probably a pillar of the community. Whereas Judy Hopps almost destroyed the entire city because of the things that she said, because of her activism, because she's a young girl attempting to fix the entire world without the means of doing so. And so what they actually did by creating Gideon Grey is they actually showed how deeply flawed and stupid their character is. No one should want to be like Judy Hopps, because Judy Hopps doesn't know what she's doing and she doesn't have her own house in order, right? It's Gideon Grey who has his own house in order, who then branches into a business, who then branches outward from the community. He starts inside and moves outward, and very little inner introspection, very little inner work is done through Judy Hopps. Instead, she starts by trying to change the world and just keeps going until she eventually gets it right. So I think this kind of, to sum it up, Zootopia's political portrayal was intended to be left-wing propaganda for children. And instead, I think the themes of the film really kind of come alive only when they have their natural conservative counterparts. And these natural conservative counterparts really begin to highlight how horrible of a film this is. Judy Hopps is a terrible person. The city of Zootopia is run in a terrible way. And most of the political actors within the film are terrible people. There's only one real hero in the story, and that's Gideon Grey. And so if you watch the film Zootopia, or your children watch the film Zootopia, right, go ahead and watch it. It's great to get ideas from every perspective. But if you've got your kid down on the floor, or in the playroom, or in the pack and play, wherever he or she is, tell them, try and be more like Gideon Grey. And when they're confused, explain to them that, he was a bully, but he learned to be better than a bully, and he worked on himself, and he found out who he was. Because I'm not sure that any of these characters really discovered themselves or did any good for the setting of Zootopia, except for Gideon Grey. If you like more videos like this, please give us a like, subscribe, comment, anything to help the algorithm. Go on our Discord where where we're looking to grow a community and have all kinds of conversations where you can ask questions about the videos that we do or questions about the live stream. Check us out on Twitch, and please have a wonderful day.